In 1993, construction workers in Dublin made a discovery that would shatter Ireland's carefully maintained facade. Behind the walls of a former convent, they found something the Catholic Church had desperately tried to hide. Not gold, not ancient manuscripts, bodies, hundreds of them, buried in unmarked mass graves. These weren't plague victims or famine dead. These were the remains of women and girls who had been imprisoned, enslaved, and worked to death inside institutions run by the Catholic Church, institutions that operated with full government support, places where rape by priests was routine, where babies were stolen from their mothers and sold to wealthy families, where young women died from exhaustion, disease, and suicide. The last of these prisons didn't close until 1996, not 1896, 1996. Just 29 years ago. This is the story of the Magdalene Laundries, Ireland's system of Catholic gulags that imprisoned over 30,000 women and girls for the crime of being female. A system of forced labor, sexual slavery, and institutional murder that operated for 74 years with absolute impunity. The Magdalene Laundries were concentration camps disguised as charitable institutions. The Catholic Church claimed they were homes for fallen women who needed redemption through prayer and hard work. The reality was industrial-scale slavery operated by nuns who wielded absolute power over their victims. Between 1922 and 1996, over 30,000 women and girls were imprisoned in these institutions. Most were teenagers. Some were as young as 9 years old. Their crimes: being raped, getting pregnant outside marriage, being too attractive, flirting with boys, having a baby out of wedlock, being orphaned with no family to protect them, or simply being poor and female in a country where the Catholic Church controlled every aspect of society. These weren't voluntary stays. Women were kidnapped from their homes by police and priests working together. Girls were handed over by their own families who believed the Church's propaganda about sin and redemption. Young mothers who sought help after being raped were immediately imprisoned. Once inside, there was no way out. No trials, no sentences, no release dates. Women spent decades trapped inside these institutions, and many died there, buried in unmarked graves. The Church operated 10 major Magdalene Laundries across Ireland, with the largest in Dublin, Cork, Galway, and Limerick. Each institution functioned as a forced labor camp, where women worked 16-hour days, 7 days a week, washing laundry for hotels, hospitals, the military, and the Irish government itself. The Church profited enormously from this slave labor, while paying the women nothing. The routine was brutal and designed to break spirits. Wake at 5:30 in the morning, mandatory prayer, then into the laundries where women stood for hours in scalding steam, scrubbing sheets and clothing by hand with caustic chemicals that burned their skin. No protective equipment, no breaks except for minimal meals of watery soup and stale bread. No medical care when injuries occurred. No heating in winter. No relief from the suffocating heat in summer. Women worked until their hands bled, until they collapsed from exhaustion, until the chemicals destroyed their lungs. The nuns who ran these institutions showed no mercy. They beat women who worked too slowly. They starved women who complained. They locked women in isolation cells for days as punishment for the smallest infractions, speaking without permission, smiling, making eye contact with another prisoner. All were grounds for savage beatings. The physical labor was only part of the horror. The Magdalene Laundries were hunting grounds for predatory priests who understood they had unlimited access to defenseless victims. The Church's own internal documents, later revealed through investigations, showed that rape by priests was systematic and covered up at the highest levels. Priests visited the laundries regularly, claiming to provide spiritual guidance. Instead, they selected victims. Young women and girls were called to private rooms for confession, where they were sexually assaulted. Those who became pregnant from these rapes were blamed for seducing the priests. The priests faced no consequences. The victims were punished with increased labor, beatings, and public humiliation. The nuns who ran these institutions knew exactly what was happening. They facilitated it. They delivered victims to their rapists. They threatened women who tried to report the abuse. And when women became pregnant from these assaults, the nuns orchestrated one of the most evil aspects of the entire system. the theft and sale of babies. When women in the laundries gave birth, their babies were taken from them immediately. No exceptions. Mothers were told their children had died, been adopted by good Catholic families, or were being cared for by the church. All lies. The truth was far more sinister. The Catholic Church ran a sophisticated baby trafficking operation. Newborns stolen from Magdalene Laundry prisoners were sold to wealthy Catholic families, primarily in America. These adoptions were illegal. Birth certificates were falsified. Medical records were destroyed. The church made enormous profits while telling desperate mothers their babies were dead. Thousands of women spent their entire lives searching for children they were told had died, not knowing those children were alive and had been sold to families overseas. Thousands of adopted children grew up believing they were orphans, not knowing their mothers had been imprisoned and their births had been erased from official records. The scale of this trafficking operation was massive. Between 1922 and 1996, an estimated 60,000 babies were stolen from Irish mothers, many of them prisoners in the Magdalene Laundries. The church pocketed millions while destroying tens of thousands of families. Life expectancy inside the Magdalene Laundries was drastically lower than in the general population. Women died from tuberculosis, pneumonia, and other diseases that spread rapidly in the overcrowded, unsanitary conditions. They died from injuries sustained during beatings by nuns. They died from complications from childbirth, when medical care was deliberately withheld. And they died by suicide, choosing death over continued enslavement. The death rate was so high that each laundry maintained its own burial ground. When women died, they were buried quickly and quietly in unmarked graves. No death certificates were filed. No families were notified. The women simply disappeared, erased from existence as if they had never lived at all. Survivors who eventually escaped or were released decades later described conditions that amounted to torture. They were forbidden from speaking to each other. They were stripped of their names and given numbers instead. Their hair was cut short or shaved completely as punishment and humiliation. They were forced to wear identical gray uniforms that marked them as prisoners. They were told constantly that they were sinners who deserved their suffering. The psychological abuse was as systematic as the physical brutality. Nuns told the imprisoned women they were worthless, that their families had abandoned them because they were shameful, that they would never be accepted by society, that their only hope for redemption was to work until they died, suffering as penance for their supposed sins. Many women internalized these messages and believed they deserved their imprisonment. The church's propaganda was so effective that even after release, survivors felt crushing shame and refused to speak about their experiences for decades. They had been so thoroughly brainwashed that they blamed themselves rather than their captors. The few women who tried to escape faced savage retribution. Those caught were beaten publicly as a warning to others. They were locked in isolation cells for weeks. They were denied food. They were forced to work even longer hours with even more brutal tasks. The nuns made escape attempts so costly that most women stopped trying and resigned themselves to dying in captivity. The church ensured that society viewed these imprisoned women with contempt rather than sympathy. Priests preached from pulpits about the need to separate fallen women from decent society. The Irish government passed laws that made it legal to indefinitely confine women accused of sexual immorality without trial. The police returned escapees to the laundries rather than investigating the conditions inside. Every institution in Irish society was complicit in maintaining this system of slavery. For 74 years, the Magdalene Laundries operated in plain sight. Everyone knew they existed. Everyone knew women were imprisoned there. But Irish society chose to look away. The church's power was absolute. Questioning the church meant risking your own family's safety, your livelihood, your social standing. So, people stayed silent while 30,000 women were enslaved and thousands died. In September 1993, that silence was finally broken. A development company purchased property that had belonged to a Magdalene laundry in Dublin. They were preparing to build new housing when construction workers began uncovering human remains. At first, they thought they had found an old cemetery. Then they realized something was terribly wrong. The remains were buried in mass graves with no coffins, no markers, no records. Many bodies showed signs of trauma. Some were incomplete, suggesting the dead had been dumped rather than properly buried. Forensic investigators eventually confirmed what survivors had been saying for years. These were the bodies of women who had died in the laundries, buried like garbage and forgotten. The church's initial response was predictable. They claimed the mass grave was an old cemetery that had simply been poorly maintained. They insisted the women had died of natural causes. They refused to provide any records about who was buried there or how they had died. They threatened legal action against anyone who suggested wrongdoing, but the discovery of the mass grave triggered a flood of testimony from survivors who had finally found the courage to speak. Women came forward describing decades of imprisonment, forced labor, sexual abuse, and witnessing deaths that were never recorded. Their accounts were consistent, detailed, and horrifying. The Irish media, which had ignored the Magdalene Laundries for decades, suddenly couldn't ignore them anymore. International pressure mounted. The church was forced to acknowledge that, yes, the Magdalene Laundries had existed. Yes, women had been confined there, but they continued to downplay the abuse and insisted the institutions had been charitable rather than criminal. Forensic examination of the mass grave in Dublin revealed at least 155 bodies, but that was just one location. Investigators realized that every Magdalene laundry had similar burial grounds. The total number of women who died in these institutions and were buried in unmarked graves has never been definitively established, but estimates range from 800 to over 1,000. The church fought viciously against any attempt to identify the remains or notify families. They claimed it was impossible to determine who the dead women were. They refused to open their internal records. They threatened to sue anyone who accused them of wrongdoing. They mobilized their political allies to block investigations. It took years of pressure from survivors' advocacy groups and international human rights organizations before the Irish government finally agreed to a formal investigation. And even then, the investigation was limited in scope and designed to protect the church from criminal prosecution. While investigators were uncovering mass graves and survivors were testifying about decades of abuse, the Magdalene Laundries were still operating. The last institution didn't close until October 1996. Let that sink in. While the world was using the internet, while people were watching cable news coverage of the mass grave discovery, women were still imprisoned and enslaved in Catholic church-run forced labor camps in Ireland. The final closure came not because the church suddenly developed a conscience, but because the publicity made continued operation impossible. Even then, the church tried to rebrand the remaining laundry as a commercial laundry that just happened to employ women who lived on site. The women inside told a different story. They described the same forced labor, the same lack of freedom, the same systematic abuse that had defined the institutions for 74 years. In 2013, the Irish government finally issued an official apology. Taoiseach Enda Kenny stood before Parliament and acknowledged that the state had failed to protect women and girls from systematic abuse. He admitted that the government had profited from contracts with the laundries while knowing about the conditions inside. He promised redress for survivors. But the apology rang hollow. The government's redress scheme was designed to minimize payouts and avoid full accountability. Survivors were offered an average of €60,000 each. No admission of illegal imprisonment. No criminal charges against the nuns who had beaten and starved women. No prosecution of priests who had raped prisoners. No accountability for the trafficking of babies. The Catholic Church never issued a formal apology. They expressed regret that women had suffered, but they refused to accept responsibility. They fought every lawsuit. They blocked access to internal records that could identify the women buried in mass graves. They protected the nuns and priests who had perpetrated the abuse by moving them to other positions and shielding them from prosecution. Of the 30,000 women who were imprisoned in the Magdalene Laundries, fewer than 1,000 were still alive when the redress scheme was established in 2013. Most had died decades earlier, many from poverty, addiction, and suicide. They received nothing. Their families received nothing. The church kept every penny of profit it had made from their forced labor. The survivors who did come forward for redress faced a deliberately humiliating process. They were required to provide extensive documentation proving their imprisonment, despite the fact that the church and government had destroyed most records. They had to detail the abuse they suffered to government officials who treated them with skepticism. They were offered pitiful sums in exchange for signing agreements never to speak publicly about their experiences or sue the church. Many survivors refused the redress payments out of principle. They didn't want money. They wanted justice. They wanted criminal prosecutions. They wanted the truth about what happened to their babies. They wanted the church to be held accountable. They got none of it. The women who survived the Magdalene Laundries and lived long enough to tell their stories describe experiences that defy comprehension. Mary Norris was 14 years old when she was sent to a laundry in 1943 after her mother died, and she had nowhere else to go. She spent 13 years in prison there, working in the laundries until her hands were permanently scarred by chemicals. She was never paid a single penny. When she was finally released in 1956, she had no skills, no education, no money, and no way to survive. She ended up homeless. Patricia Burke was raped by a neighbor when she was 16. When she became pregnant, her family sent her to a Magdalene laundry rather than reporting the rape to police. Her baby was taken from her immediately after birth, and she was told the child had died. 50 years later, she discovered her daughter had been sold to an American family and had been alive the entire time. They were reunited in 2010, but both women carry the trauma of decades of lies and separation. Josephine McCarthy entered a laundry in 1957 at age 13 because she was caught talking to a boy. She spent the next 11 years imprisoned there. She describes being beaten regularly by nuns who told her she was worthless and sinful. She watched women die from exhaustion and disease. She was denied education and basic health care. When she was finally released in 1968, she was 24 years old, with no work history, no references, and deep psychological trauma. She attempted suicide twice in the following years. These are just 3 stories among thousands. Every survivor has a similar account of imprisonment, forced labor, abuse, and lifelong trauma. Every survivor describes the same pattern of church and government collusion to maintain the system. Every survivor talks about the decades of silence, the shame they were made to feel, and the relief of finally being believed. But speaking out came at a cost. Survivors who went public with their stories faced harassment from church defenders who called them liars. They were accused of exaggerating or seeking money. Their families often refused to support them, preferring to maintain the fiction that the Magdalene Laundries had been charitable institutions. Irish society, which had been complicit in the system for 74 years, was reluctant to confront its own guilt. The psychological impact on survivors has been profound and lasting. Studies of Magdalene Laundry survivors show rates of PTSD, depression, and anxiety far higher than the general population. Many never married or had children because they couldn't trust anyone after what they experienced. Many struggled with addiction as they tried to numb the memories. Many lived in poverty because they had been denied education and job training during the years they should have been building careers. The intergenerational trauma extends to the stolen babies. Thousands of children grew up believing they were orphans, only to discover as adults that their mothers had been imprisoned and their births had been covered up. These individuals describe profound identity crises, anger at the lies they were told, and grief for the relationships they were denied. Many have spent years trying to locate their biological mothers, only to discover they died decades ago, still believing their babies were dead. The Magdalene Laundries weren't an accident or an aberration. They were a deliberate system designed to control women in a society where the Catholic Church held absolute power. Understanding how they operated for 74 years requires understanding the unique relationship between church and state in Ireland. When Ireland gained independence from Britain in 1922, the Catholic Church immediately positioned itself as the moral authority of the new nation. The Church ran the schools, the hospitals, the orphanages, and most social services. The Irish Constitution, written in 1937, gave the Church a special position that effectively made Catholic doctrine the law of the land. In this environment, women had almost no legal rights. They couldn't serve on juries. They were banned from many professions. They needed their husband's permission to work outside the home. Contraception was illegal. Divorce was illegal. Abortion was illegal. Sex outside marriage was considered a sin so severe that it justified indefinite imprisonment. The Church preached an ideology of female purity that categorized women into only 2 types: virtuous mothers and wives, or fallen sinners who threatened society. There was no middle ground. A single sexual encounter outside marriage marked a woman as irredeemably corrupt. Rape victims were treated as seducers rather than victims. Pregnant unmarried women were considered moral contaminants who needed to be removed from public view. The Magdalene Laundries served multiple purposes within this system. They removed problematic women from society. They generated massive profits through forced labor. They reinforced the message that female sexuality would be brutally punished. And they gave the church a population of enslaved workers who could be exploited without consequence. The Irish government was fully complicit. Police delivered women to the laundries. Courts sentenced women to laundry imprisonment without trial. Government agencies paid the church to take in women they considered morally suspect. The Department of Justice maintained contracts with the laundries for prison laundry services, knowing the work was done by enslaved women. Irish society at large accepted the system because it was based on deeply ingrained misogyny. Families would rather send daughters to a laundry than face the shame of an out-of-wedlock pregnancy. Employers could threaten workers with commitment to a laundry if they complained about sexual harassment. Men faced no consequences for rape or abandoning pregnant women, while their victims were imprisoned. The system protected male power and privilege while destroying women's lives. The international community largely ignored the Magdalene Laundries, despite occasional reports about the conditions inside. Other Catholic countries operated similar institutions, so there was little incentive to criticize Ireland. Britain, despite its history of conflict with Ireland, said nothing about the systematic abuse of women occurring just across the border. The United Nations didn't investigate. Human rights organizations didn't intervene. For 74 years, the world looked away while 30,000 women were enslaved. Today, nearly 3 decades after the last Magdalene Laundry closed, the fight for justice continues. Survivors are dying with their demands for accountability unmet. The Catholic Church still refuses to fully open its records. The Irish government still protects church property and assets from legal claims. And Irish society still struggles to confront its role in enabling 74 years of systematic abuse. In 2021, the Irish government announced plans to create a memorial to Magdalene Laundry victims. Survivors rejected the proposal, calling it an empty gesture designed to provide closure without justice. They don't want memorials, they want prosecutions. They want the full truth about who died, where they're buried, and what happened to the stolen babies. They want the church stripped of its power and assets. They want the nuns who beat them to face trial. They want the priests who raped them to be imprisoned. None of that has happened. Not one person has been criminally charged for the systematic abuse, forced labor, sexual violence, or trafficking that occurred in the Magdalene Laundries. The church successfully argued that too much time has passed for prosecutions to be viable. Survivors' civil lawsuits have been dismissed or settled for minimal amounts with non-disclosure agreements attached. The stolen babies, now elderly adults themselves, are still fighting for access to their own birth records. The Catholic Church's response to the Magdalene Laundry scandal has been consistent denial and minimization. Church officials claim the laundries were well-intentioned institutions that simply reflected the social attitudes of their time. They argue that conditions inside were no worse than other institutions. They insist that most women entered voluntarily and were free to leave. All of these claims are demonstrably false, contradicted by survivor testimony, historical records, and the evidence of mass graves. The church has also argued that it shouldn't be held financially responsible for what happened in the laundries, because the religious orders that ran them were separate entities. This is a legal fiction designed to protect church assets. The same institution that claims the religious orders acted independently also claims to represent all Catholics and demands continued influence over Irish education and healthcare. What makes the ongoing denial particularly galling is that the evidence is overwhelming and undeniable. We have survivor testimony from hundreds of women describing identical experiences across different institutions over decades. We have the mass graves. We have government reports confirming the system of forced labor and church profiteering. We have the stolen babies who have been reunited with their mothers. We have the records of payments from the government to the church for laundry services. The truth is not in question. Only accountability remains elusive. The Magdalene Laundries operated for 74 years. The last one closed in 1996. 30,000 women were imprisoned. Thousands died and were buried in unmarked graves. 60,000 babies were stolen and trafficked. The Catholic Church profited enormously. The Irish government was fully complicit, and no one has been held accountable. This wasn't ancient history. This happened in living memory in a Western democratic nation. The women who survived are still fighting for justice today. The stolen children, now elderly, are still searching for truth. The mass graves are still being excavated. The records are still being hidden. The Magdalene Laundries are a testament to what happens when religious institutions are given unchecked power over vulnerable populations. They are proof that systematic abuse can operate in plain sight if society chooses to look away. They're evidence that misogyny, when institutionalized and backed by state power, becomes a form of slavery as brutal as any in history. Ireland's Magdalene Laundries weren't an aberration. They were a system that destroyed tens of thousands of lives, a system that was allowed to operate for 3/4 of a century, a system that still hasn't been fully dismantled or accounted for. The women who survived deserve more than apologies and memorials. They deserve justice. They deserve the full truth. They deserve to see their torturers held accountable. They deserve to know what happened to their babies. They deserve to see the church stripped of the power and wealth it gained through their enslavement. Until that happens, the Magdalene Laundries remain an open wound, a reminder that even in modern democracies, unchecked power corrupts. Even in supposedly civilized societies, systematic evil can thrive, and even today the powerful can commit atrocities against the vulnerable and escape justice.